local history, local culture, local events, your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the show. James Pula is our guest. Jim is a historian. He's an author. He's a professor emeritus at Purdue University Northwest, is it, Jim?
Yes,
yeah.
Correct.
And we're going to be talking about his new book. It's the book of the 117th New York Infantry in the Civil War. And Jim, I've got to tell you, I've read a lot of histories about the Civil War. I think this is the most researched book I've ever read. My gosh, how much time did you put in just on the research?
Oh, well, thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. Research takes a long time, but fortunately, in this day and age where a lot of things are on the computer, you can get it's a little helpful. And believe it or not, with the COVID lockdowns, libraries and archives were much more amenable to scanning things and emailing them. So I think I researched that probably for about 6 or 7 years altogether before I actually started writing it.
And how much time did the writing take, Jim?
About 5-6 months, about 5 or 6 months.
Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
We should point out that the 117th New York is also known as the 4th New York, right?
It was the
4th Oneida County.
Yeah, the 4th Oneida.
4th Oneida.
Because it was the 4th Regiment that was raised in Oneida County. There was the 14th, 26th, 97th were the first three. And then in the summer of 1862, when they needed more troops, they put out a call for more regiments. And what they usually did was if they needed, say, 300,000 men, like they did in 1862, they would apportion it to the different states based on their population. And then most of the states would apportion that either by county or congressional district. So Oneida County had to raise 2 additional regiments. The 117th was the 4th one that they raised, hence the 4th Oneida. And then the 146th was the 5th Oneida. So the 117th and 146th were raised both in the summer of 1862.
And the 117th, the 4th Oneida, excuse me, came from Utica, Rome, where else?
Yep. Well, mostly Oneida County, although there were some people from Herkimer County and the surrounding counties who came and joined up also. But it was primarily from Rome, Utica, and then the smaller towns, the Welsh communities, Vernon, Verona, New York Mills, New Hartford, Whitestown.
You mentioned New York Mills. We should point out you're a New York Mills native, yes?
Yes, graduated in 1964. It's hard to believe it's been that long.
Well, and a frequent guest on our show is your sister, Cheryl.
Yep.
And she's nice enough to come in from time to time to talk about some of the topics that she lectures on throughout the area. Why did you pick the 4th Oneida? Why not the 1st Oneida? Why not one of the others?
Yeah. Well, some of the other regiments already had histories written about them, particularly the 26th, the 97th, the 146th. They were all in the Army of the Potomac. People have written about them at Gettysburg and in the Wilderness and other famous battles. The 117th was a little bit different because it never served in the Army of the Potomac. It served in the siege of Charleston in South Carolina, and then it served in Ben Butler's army in the sieges of Petersburg and Richmond in that area. So it served in areas that aren't covered a lot by historians, and there never had been a history of it written. Right in 1866, the year after the war ended, the surgeon, who was from Lafayette near Syracuse, wrote a history of the regiment, but it was more his observations, and he did not have available to him at that time all the different letters and diaries and things that have come to light since then. So this is really the first history of that regiment, which performed some important duties during the war.
I mentioned earlier how well researched this is. the sources that you went to, a lot of newspapers, a lot of diaries. I'm surprised at the number of diaries these soldiers kept.
Yeah, it's a lot of them did that, and if they didn't keep a diary, they would write home as often as they could. And it's amazing how often, if you look at what the soldiers are writing, how often they're telling the folks back home, you know, I haven't heard from you in a week, please write, what's going on? You know, there's no television, there's no radio. The only way they had to communicate with people back home and know how their loved ones were doing was by mail. So they wrote a lot, and fortunately, some of their descendants donated some of this material to local historical societies and so on. Oneida County History Center has a lot of Civil War materials, and they were very helpful to me in my research.
And I see that a lot of there's a lot of photos in here, and there's a lot of maps in here, and the Oneida County History Center gets credited for a lot of that. So does Don Wisnowski.
Yeah, Don Wisnowski. He has a fantastic collection of Oneida County materials, and it's a really, really nice guy, very willing to share everything. So Don was very helpful to me in my research.
My guess is that much of the images, many of the images that appear in the book are appearing for the first time.
I think so. There are a few of the commanding officers, like Colonel Pease or Egbert Bagg, who was a major, have appeared here and there in different articles. But the private soldiers, for the most part, they haven't. And I like, when I'm reading about somebody, I like to see what they look like. So I'm kind of visual in that sense. And I had a rather famous Civil War cartographer draw the maps for me, so that as you read about what's going on, you can actually see where they are and kind of get a better impression of how close to Richmond they were or how close to other places they were at the time.
Yeah, we'll talk when we come back about when they mustered in and they went out on a train out of Rome and where they went. Jim Pula is our guest. We're talking about his new book, The 117th New York Infantry in the Civil War. Short break, right back. And thanks for sticking with us, everybody. Welcome back. We're talking to Jim Pula. Jim is out with a new book, The 117th New York Infantry in the Civil War. It's just out. He's going to be doing a talk and a signing where?
It's going to be at the New York Mills Senior Citizen Center on Main Street, right off of Main Street, Monday night at 7 p.m.
That's this coming?
This coming Monday, 7 p.m.
Okay. Yep. And Jim, you're going to do something later on in the year at the Oneida County History Center as well, right?
This September, I think. I don't have the specific date yet.
Okay.
But we're going to do a presentation on the 117th and a book signing. And the one this coming Monday is on the 117th also.
Okay. And the book sells for how much, Jim?
I believe it's $34.95.
Okay.
Yep.
And you know what's interesting, because I don't know how eBay works, but I looked on eBay the other day and I see the book there, but then I see it for $34.95 in one spot, but I saw it as much as $118 somewhere else.
Yeah, online it's amazing. I think it's published at $45, but when you buy them online from the publisher, I think it's $34.95. And depending on what website you go to, you can find them. You know, the price is all over the place.
Yeah. Where would you recommend people going if they want to buy it online?
Well, Amazon is usually cheaper than other places. Or sometimes if you go to the publisher's website, McFarland, they have discounts for buying things rather than what their list price is.
Okay. The 117th, the 4th Oneida, mustered in What was the date?
It began mustering in August 8th, 1862, and it mustered in over the next roughly week to 10 days, and then headed off to Washington, D.C.
They went by a train out of Rome, right?
Yep. They went from Rome on a train to Albany. They were put on a boat from Albany, actually two boats, down the Hudson River to New York City. And from New York City, they again took train from New York to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then Washington, D.C.
And their first assignment was to defend Washington, yes?
Yeah, they did not have a heck of a lot of training because of the urgency of the situation. They received their rifles en route. I think it was in New Jersey they were given some rifles.
But no bullets.
Didn't really have any ammunition until they got to D.C. So I think one of the reasons they weren't sent immediately to the Army was that the rest of the troops needed to make sure they had rifles, they needed to have ammunition, they needed to have some practice with them. So they were placed in the defenses of Washington, D.C. for several months until April of 1863.
And then they went where, Jim?
From there they went to Suffolk, Virginia, part of the Confederate Army under James Longstreet, part of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, had been sent to the Suffolk area to try and evict the Federals from there. So they were sent to the Suffolk area to make that secure against Longstreet's attacks. They did that. And then during the Gettysburg campaign, while the Confederate Army was marching north into Maryland and Pennsylvania, they were sent on a march toward Petersburg and Richmond. The idea was to threaten Petersburg and Richmond so that the Confederates could not send reinforcements to Lee. They had to keep their reinforcements there to protect the two cities. So it was like a feint almost. But the weather was like 100 degrees. Several people had heat stroke, 2 or 3 of them died just from the marching in such weather.
Jim, I've got to ask you this. I'm going to backtrack a little bit here now. But the cover of your book, there's a battle there. There's a picture of a battle. What battle is that?
It's the Battle of Fort Fisher. The Fort Fisher was the last, by late 1864, it was the last major Confederate seaport that had not been shut down by the Union Army and Navy. So virtually all of the supplies for Richmond and Petersburg coming in from England and France and overseas were coming through Wilmington, North Carolina. And Fort Fisher was the fort on the Atlantic coast that was guarding the entryway to Fort Fisher. So the 117th was part of the group of regiments that was sent down to North Carolina to try and capture Fort Fisher and cut off the last line of supplies into Richmond and Petersburg.
Also on the cover are 2 decorations. What are those decorations?
The one on the left, as you look at it, the little diamond-shaped thing with the blue background, is the symbol of the 10th Army Corps. And the 117th moved around a little bit, but for most of the war it was part of the 10th Corps. And after the war was over, when they formed a veterans organization, they adopted the symbol of the 10th Corps as part of their regimental veterans symbol.
And the one on the other side?
The one on the other side was for one of the reunions. Following the war, the veterans, 5 or 6 years after the end of the war, they formed, as many regiments did, a Regimental Veterans Association. And they would meet each year someplace in Oneida County, Utica, 1 year, Rome, and then Vernon, and then Verona, and then somewhere else. So that every year up through the early 1900s, they would have an annual reunion, and each one they would have a different symbol or a ribbon that they would then wear with the name of the town and the annual reunion.
Where did you find the pictures of these decorations?
Well, some of them are in the Oneida County History Center. Some were in the Rome Historical Society. I bought 2 or 3 of them online. The U.S. Army History Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania has a huge collection of not only photographs and regimental badges, but also diaries and letter collections and so forth.
So you have a pretty substantial collection yourself, huh?
Well, I wouldn't say substantial, but every now and then I pick something up.
Yeah. Jim, the 117th had, like every other unit in the Army, had flags, and flags were very important to these units. I didn't realize until reading some history just how important they were. Do any of the flags for the 117th still exist?
There are some remnants of flags in the Oneida County History Center. In combat, with cannons going off and rifles going off and huge amounts of smoke covering the battle lines, the flags were usually placed in the center, and if you couldn't hear the orders, you watched the colors of the regiment. If they went forward, you went forward. If they went back, you went back. So they were important in that respect, but they were also important because they were symbols of the people back home. In the case of the 117th, the ladies of Utica paid for, and I believe hand wove, a standard, a color, for the regiment that they gave to them. And it was kind of interesting. As the 4th Oneida County Regiment, there were 3 preceding it, obviously. In giving them their colors, they wrote them a letter in which they essentially said, all the regiments before you have done well. None of them have disgraced us. We're giving you these colors. We want you to bear them nobly, and as they said, quote, with honorable marks, end quote. And then at the end of the letter, they said, essentially, and if you don't bother coming back.
Talk about being put under some pressure, right?
And at the end of the war, they brought the colors back. I think it was 1897 they donated them to the History Center when they were getting older and could no longer. But if you look at pictures of the colors when they donated them, there's almost nothing left of them.
Right.
There's just a few threads dangling.
In fact, you've got a couple pictures of in your book. Jim Pula is our guest. We're talking about the 4th Oneida in the Civil War. Short break, right back. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Jim Pula is our guest. He's out with his new book, The 117th New York Infantry in the Civil War, also called The 4th Oneida. And Jim, did they, would you say they distinguished themselves? Did they, how would you say the 4th Oneida did during the Civil War?
Well, I think they did pretty well. They had 3 sets of colors, federal one, the Stars and Stripes, a state color, and then the local one that the ladies presented them. They didn't lose any of them in any of the combats they were in. They captured 3 enemy colors, which is usually a sign of pretty good fighting. Probably the most important battle they were in was Fort Fisher.
Where's Fort Fisher?
Fort Fisher's in at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, outside of Wilmington, North Carolina. As I mentioned earlier, it was an extremely important port for provisioning Lee's army in Richmond and Petersburg. And when the final assault was made at Fort Fisher, which is on the cover of the book, the regiments that went forward, all of them faltered. All of them went to ground and tried to find some cover, except for the 117th and part of the regiment next to it. They fought their way through a swamp. They chopped their way through a 9-foot barrier of logs. They scaled the Confederate ramparts, and they were the first one to place their flag inside the Confederate works. Reinforcements that came in then followed them. And that led to the fall of the fort, the elimination of Wilmington as a port of entry. And really, when Lee's supplies ran out, that's when he had to abandon Richmond. So the fall of Fort Fisher was a really significant event led by the 117th.
How bad were their casualties?
Casualties in that battle, I think, were around 92 or 95, if I'm not mistaken.
Overall?
Overall, they lost 137 killed, 137 who died from disease, the exact same number. Overall, out of about, there's 1,400 and something enrolled, but a couple hundred of those were enrolled in the last month of the war and never really served with the regiment. So if you look at just the roughly 1,200 men who actually served in the regiment in one battle or another, I think there were 654 casualties total, killed, wounded, people who were missing and never found, so over half.
Yeah. When they came home, before I get to that, where are they buried?
Some of them were brought back to Oneida County, especially the officers were brought back. Some of them were buried on the battlefields where they fell. A couple are in Andersonville prison where they died as prisoners of war. So they're really scattered all over where the regiment fought its battles.
Yeah, there's a big, I don't know much about Andersonville, except that it was a horrendous place. Yeah. But a lot of the people that died there are just still there, buried there?
Yeah, yeah, and you can go online and they have a list of all the people in their regiment. Some of them, of course, are unknown. Some of them would come to the prison and die within 2 or 3 days. They didn't know anybody there, nobody knew them, so they were simply never recorded.
When the 117th came back to Oneida County, what kind of a reception, if any, did they get?
Well, it was amazing. They, when they got to Albany by train from New York, they had telegrams waiting for them there that a reception was being planned. They get to Utica and there was a huge banquet spread prepared for them, and all along the way as the train passed, people would come out and wave and there'd be bands playing songs and so forth. So it was a really big deal when these people came back from the war, especially as diminished as the regiments were. You know, going out to DC with 900 and some odd men and coming back with around 300, you can imagine that the survivors and their families were pretty happy to be reunited after 3 years.
Yeah. Jim, this isn't your first book. My guess is it's not your last book either.
No, right now I'm working on a book on another Utica native, Daniel Butterfield, a biography of him. It's essentially completed. I'm just waiting for the publisher to get around to issuing it.
Yeah, I was talking about Daniel Butterfield just the other day at NVILR, and just in passing. But Daniel Butterfield, I think, and I told this to your sister when she was on this show, that is a tremendous story. We only know about, well, a lot of people just know about the TAPS portion. But boy, there's so much more to that story.
Yeah, Butterfield, when he first went into the Army, he wrote a manual for training the troops, which was then adopted by the Army of the Potomac and then eventually adopted by the entire Army as a way to train all of these volunteers who were rushing to the colors. He also, when he was a combat commander in 1862, he was awarded the Medal of Honor during one of the, for his conduct during one of the engagements. He later served in the West under Grant and Sherman, and if you look at Grant and Sherman and Thomas, very well-respected generals, they all had very high praise for Butterfield and the way he performed.
Didn't he also initiate shoulder patches for the Army?
Yes, he was the one who initially suggested in the Army of the Potomac that each unit have a different patch or device to identify them. So when an officer on horseback is riding along, he can tell where the different troops that he's looking at belong. The only one that took him up on it was Phil Kearny, who developed a little badge for his corps. But later in the war, in 1863, Butterfield becomes the chief of staff of the Army of the Potomac, and he convinces General Hooker that this is a good idea, not only for identification, but to boost the esprit de corps of the people. This is my badge. This is the corps I believe to. The other thing Butterfield did, which people generally don't know, is he was behind ordering the different regiments to list the battles they had participated in on their flags. Again, as a way of increasing their esprit de corps, their morale, and so forth, by showing people, where they had been and what they had done.
And I think he retired as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, did he
Yes,
not?
he did.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, he retired, and then his father founded what later became the American Express Company.
Yeah.
And he later took over his father's business after he retired from public life.
Yeah. And he's buried at West Point.
Buried at West Point. I think he was the first non-West Point graduate to be buried at West Point. So he had to get a special dispensation from the War Department to be buried there.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the person who signed it, I forget what his name was, but he was a native of Central New York working in the War Department.
Yeah. Give the time and the date and the place for your upcoming signing.
This coming Monday at the Senior Citizen Center right off of Main Street in New York Mills, 7 p.m. We'll be talking about the 117th and signing books at a discount for anyone who wishes to obtain one.
If you come back in September to speak at the United County History Center, come in and talk to us
Be
too.
happy to, Joe.
Good.
Thanks for the invitation.
Well, you're welcome, and good luck with the book, and good luck with the Butterfield book. You got to come back and talk to us about that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, that's going to do it for us this week. We'll be back next week. We'll do it all again. Don't forget SandWhyHomepage.com. There's lots of good stuff there. Until next time, take care of yourself, everybody.